John, thank you for that introduction. It's always nice to meet a fellow class president and a fellow fraternity brother. And if you've gotten over your fear and are thinking about running for mayor of New York City, I'd appreciate it if you'd wait 3.5 years. I am truly honored to have been invited to speak at my alma mater in this lovely day, at least not this past February during the famous snowstorm. Actually, I hear it was a lot of fun. Everyone just hung out, didn't go to class, got nothing accomplished. Actually, that sounded like my entire freshman year here. My plan this morning was to give a speech reminiscing about my 4 years at Hopkins in the 1960s. But you know what they say about the 60s? If you can remember them, you weren't there. Having said that, being here at Homewood Field reminds me of my graduation, which took place on the Upper Quad in front of Gilman. Our commencement speaker was Lester Pearson, a former Prime Minister of Canada and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he talked for what seemed like 2 hours under a hot, blazing sun on a subject that completely escapes me. It really was enough to turn you off a career in government. Well, actually, almost. So I promised to be brief, and besides, I know this is a little early in the morning for some of you. You probably were tired from a night at PJ's. And I just don't want to be the last hurdle between your degree and me. Before I go, let me offer some thoughts, however, that you graduates will undoubtedly cherish word for decades to come. And before I do that, let me just seriously thank another very important group here. Pam Flaherty talked about them. I'm talking about the group sitting out there this morning, beaming proudly, not even thinking about what it costs to get you to this day, or what happens if you can't find a job and move back home. They are your parents and relatives, and I thought you might want to give them another big hand. Now, as you can guess, Johns Hopkins holds a special place in my heart. I arrived on campus 50 years ago, and over the succeeding 4 years, as you may have gathered, I did not have a great academic record. As I often like to say, I was the kind of student that made the top half of the class possible. And I don't even have the excuse of saying that I took Intro to Microeconomics with Professor Hamilton. But I did have a lot of fun here, perhaps a bit too much. I'm only glad they didn't have digital cameras to record it. All would have wound up on YouTube. And despite what our fan told you, I do come back to visit the campus quite often. Who do you think fills in for the shush lady when she needs a breather, keep you all quiet? Every time I visit, I can't help but think how much things have changed here since I matriculated. In my freshman year, I think tuition had for the first year gone over $1,000 a year. Today it's 40 times that. Back then, the undergraduate school was 1,400 undergraduates on the Homewood campus. Today, there are 4 times that number, and apparently every one of them is in the Milton Eisenhower Library. I can only tell you the library didn't exist when I started here. I watched the hole being dug for it. And then when I went here, my fraternity house was the center of good times, good fellowship, and good beer. The good beer was actually my responsibility. And today, to show you how things have changed, the house has been sold to a nearby high school, and they're currently tearing it down and turning it into a parking lot. But wait a second, I don't want you to think that I was one of those old codgers who believes that everything was better back in the good old days. In fact, in many ways, the good old days were actually worse. For one thing, we didn't have many of the great facilities that you enjoy today. No swimming pool, no rock climbing mall, there was no Carey Business School, no School of Education. And while we did have a School of Health, there was something missing in the name. I'm not sure what that was. Also back then, our baseball team wasn't playing in the College World Series. Go Jays! And most importantly, there was not a single woman going to school on this campus. And that wasn't unusual for educational institutions back then. The point I want to make is that this institution has come a very long way since 1960. And at the same time, so has our country. And that brings me to the real message that I want to share with you today. When I arrived 50 years ago, the promise of the American dream was still out of reach for far too many. There was no Civil Rights Act for minorities, no Voting Rights Act for the disenfranchised, no Medicaid for the poor, and no Medicare for the elderly. But by the time the 60s ended, all of that had changed. And it had changed because Americans, many of them young like you, had the courage to fight for their ideals.